Welcome to Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Will. Well, a lot of you have asked for more stuff about the Confederacy, and today we're going to make that wish come true. We're making biscuits using the camp furniture from the Army of Northern Virginia with Andrew Bentley. Before we get going, let's say thanks to two groups. First, our patrons, the Civil War Digital Digest coffee grinders, folks who give a little bit each month to make sure that we can provide the widest range of Civil War history to you free of charge here. We also want to say thanks to History Fix. It's a new history-centered streaming platform, and they're sponsoring content here. We're proud to have both our short films and several other episodes re-edited and revised shared over there. Check it out. Today, Confederate biscuits. Andrew, talk to me about this. What are we going to do and why do we do this?
So the Confederate bread ration throughout the war in the Army of Northern Virginia consisted very heavily of just plain flour. So to cook that into a usable, consumable meal, the Confederate military used spider skillets, which looked like basically a Dutch oven, to make biscuits and breads.
So Andrew, I see this spider skillet, and we've done an episode about them previously. This one's smaller. Talk to me about the differences.
Spider skillets came in 4 different sizes. They came in a 13-inch, 12-inch, an 11-inch, and a 10-inch size, as was procured by the Confederate Quartermaster Department. The 10-inch size is one of the most common sizes that was purchased by the Confederate Quartermaster and issued out to the troops in the field.
From your experience, how many men can this feed in one round?
This will usually feed a mess of soldiers, around 8 to 10, depending on how many biscuits you're issuing per man. It'll really depend on the ration size. If you're at half rations or less, obviously you have less flour to go around.
Okay, so flour. Let's take that and let's transition. We've got messware for the furniture from the commissary. What do we need to make?
So for making Confederate biscuits, the way they did, the only thing you really need is flour and water.
Okay.
To make it a little bit more palatable, lard and baking soda helped immensely. And the soldiers' accounts speak to this, where a touch of soda would make all the difference in a biscuit.
Okay, so today we have flour, we have soda, we have lard, and then we've got water in the canteen.
Yes.
Okay. Well, what do we do, and can I help you with it?
So step number 1 is actually more prep work. So first we're going to get the lid and we're going to place it upside down on the fire to get it preheated. Since we're going to be operating this as an oven, we need heat from both sides. So having this preheated will make all the difference. So that's step number 1, is getting your lid preheated while you're getting ready to make the biscuits.
And we don't need to do anything to the bottom.
Right now we don't, because you're going to have enough heat from the base of that it'll kind of even out.
Okay, great.
So then step number 2, if you grab your mess pan.
All right.
There's a couple different ways you can mix up biscuits in the field. If you're fortunate to have a mess pan, or you're somewhere more in a static camp that you have more commissary equipment, you can mix in a bowl. Another field expedient fix is using a gum blanket between a couple fence rails to create your own mixing basin right here.
Okay, so we've got 2 examples. Both are common?
Both are relatively common. This is going to be probably more common on campaign, on the march, as you're trying to quickly make some biscuits when you're not set up in a full camp. It depends on time and place where you would have access to different pieces of equipment.
Even within the Army of Northern Virginia?
Even within the Army of Northern Virginia.
Okay, so I've got a pan. You've got the gum blanket with the rails. What's next?
So up next, we'll just take a little bit of flour, dump out a little bit each, since we're both going to be making biscuits together. Let's go ahead and dump out some flour in there.
Okay. And is this, as some people say, in other words, this is sort of measure with your heart?
Yep. This is as much as you would be issued. Typically, you're going to be cooking your entire ration together. So in this instance, we're not receiving a measured amount of flour that would be cooking for our entire mess to cook one day's ration.
Okay.
So it's a little bit of eyeball work. Most of this is all just play it by ear cooking.
Okay.
So then we take a little bit of soda. I usually just take a pinch, sprinkle it in.
And if I'm trying to experience this and I'm not in the field, what is this soda?
What we're using today is just common baking soda.
Okay.
But the soldiers would have a very similar analog in their period that they just refer to as soda.
Okay, great. And we see that in the soldiers' accounts.
Correct.
Okay.
And then the next thing, take a spoonful of lard, or in this case, a knife full. And you're just going to kind of plop a big chunk of that in your flour.
All right, so.
And that'll help just give the biscuits a little bit of binding agents like a butter for it, so it's going to make it a little bit fuller and richer. That's about
right?
good. Yep.
All right.
So then the next part is going to be very similar to making hardtack, where you want a dry dough. So you're just going to slowly add in water. Sometimes it helps to coat your hands with flour, as you know, with other types of baking, just to keep it from sticking to you, because it does get to be a bit of a sticky endeavor.
And so you're mixing some of the lard in with the flour right now.
Yep, I'll sometimes dry mix the lard in there. It's fortunate though, the lard is a little bit warm today, so it mixes in kind of nicely. So from there, I'll just start adding a little bit of water in there, and again, you're going for a stickier consistency.
All right. And from other times baking, I can say you can always add more. You can't take it out.
Yes, correct.
And if you don't have extra flour sitting next to you because you've put the entire ration in, then you've got goo and a mess.
Yes. And when the soldiers were learning to do this in early 1860 or late 1861, early 1862, when this ration became more and more prevalent, there was a steep learning curve for a lot of them as they learned how to make biscuits for the first time, especially with some of the limited resources they had. So there are a number of accounts where they came out with bread where they put too much water in, and it was, you know, burned to a crisp on the outside and a wet dough mess on the inside.
That sounds not tasty.
A little more lard, a little more water, sneaking our way up on this. How many times when you started making it, did you have to make it to get something that you were calling edible?
It was about my third iteration that I finally started getting the dough consistency down and then the baking protocol down, so it didn't completely burn on the outside or burn on the top or the bottom, because there's an art to making the biscuits and there's an art to actually cooking them as well.
Okay.
So then consistency-wise and shape and size, I usually aim for something about this size here.
Okay.
It's a little bit smaller than a tennis ball. They will plump up a little bit with the soda, but not a ton.
A little bit larger. Do you find even size is important?
Even size helps with cook time. It helps allow in the even baking, so you don't end up with doughy centers on some and burnt other pieces.
Yeah. And what's the practicality of issuing rations that way too?
Correct. Yeah, having incongruent biscuit sizes can lead to some discontent in camping for sure.
Okay. Okay, so there we go. 7 of them.
Yep. So we have 7 in there. You could probably squeeze another one in there and have 8. So again, enough for a mess of soldiers to each have a biscuit. They're very dense as far as the content of flour in each one of those.
Okay, Andrew, so we've rolled up the dough and the lard, the soda, the flour, the water have made these balls. What's next?
So next we'll be taking our lid off the fire that we've been preheating here. So we'll do that now, and then we'll get it positioned on the spider, put the spider in the fire, and then cover the top with coals.
Okay. So no problem with coal sitting, and we're going to get there. This is cool, so I can still grab this,
Yep,
right?
you can grab that. Move this out of the way a little bit.
Keep the handle where we can get to it later.
Absolutely. And then, as far as getting coals on top of the actual piece itself, depends on what you have in the field. If you have access to a shovel, you can use a shovel. Using a spatula, any kind of cooking utensil, even a tin plate, are options to try to just shovel coals carefully on top of it. And you want to try to keep even heat distribution as much as possible in and around it. It's going to be very hot.
So how much do we put on top?
Just enough to be able to cover the spider itself. You can obviously mound more on if you want to, but really this is all you need if you preheated the lid well. You don't need to add too many.
And heat rises, so even though we didn't preheat the base, I see you're shoveling in around.
Yes, so yeah, just want to, again, try to keep any cold spots out and keep nice, even heat as much as you can around the base.
Okay.
Something to be cognizant of too, if you have been cooking your meat ration in the spider ahead of time, it's going to be hot. So you are going to have to try to adjust your temperature control around the base because you're going to have a spider that's already preheated. So you can end up with burned biscuits on the top that are still cooking. Burned biscuits on the bottom that are still cooking on top.
All right. And so we had a cool spider. We've got the coals on top. About how long with this 10-inch do we have to wait?
About 15 to 17 minutes.
Okay. And do we check them at all, or do we just leave the lid on and not touch it?
Leave the lid until that time. You don't want to let the hot air out of the oven. It's baking inside there. About after 15 minutes, I'll usually check them just to see how they're doing. but usually they're perfect at that point.
All right, there we go. No reason to sit with us for the next 15 minutes. We're going to set a clock for 15 minutes. We'll come back in just a little bit.
All right, so it's been 15 minutes. We're back. So, Andrew, you say this is not quite an exact art. What are we looking for?
So what I usually look for is I'll kind of pry the end, just pop the oven lid open a little bit, look to see how the top of the biscuits are looking. That's usually a good indicator. If they're not browned out of all on the top, probably need a little bit more time. Otherwise, it's going to be very doughy.
All right, let's have a look.
So I'll open it up towards you. What are you seeing?
Ooh, pretty.
I think those are good.
All right.
So what I'll usually do is I'll check the bottoms to make sure they're not too scorched on the bottom. But these ones look just like they came about perfect.
All right.
Those are great.
So you said there's a period quote about a cook being somewhat fanatical. And so he talked about this. How did the men feel afterward?
The quote says that after dealing with their somewhat tyrannical cook, when the lid came off the spider and they saw the golden brown biscuits in there, their hush fell over the mess, that their complaining stopped.
So now I assume we get this off the fire before we do anything else?
Yep, so this comes off the fire. The spider will still be very hot. And I'll usually pop the biscuits out and put them on a plate so they don't, because they'll keep cooking in the cast iron.
All right. So we'll just work them out one at a time here.
Yep.
It's going to be warm, but it has to be done. Poof. And I assume after the first one, life gets easier.
It does.
Okay, we're starting to see a little bit of harder brown here. Is this normal?
Yep.
I mean, we get to this one right down here, and that's got almost burned.
Yep, and that'll happen just depending on the heat of the fire and the length of the cook time.
And when you talk about wanting to stay even with the heat, that's what you're trying to your best to avoid.
Right, yeah, because that may be a hot spot where there was hotter coals underneath that particular part of the cast iron.
Okay. And so now we just wait and issue these out.
If you're cooking for a company size, you're going to start issuing these out. If you're cooking in a mess kind of situation, kind of eat as you go. There's instances where soldiers were on campaign where they were issued their rations, skillet wagon came up, they pulled out their skillets, cooked biscuits, ate them on the spot, packed up everything, and then marched off into the fight. So it really just depends on time and place of how you'd issue these out and how they'd be consumed afterwards.
All right. Well, do you mind? Can I try and see how they came out? All right. Let's. Still very fresh out, so still very hot. And a little bit damp inside there. It's hardtack that's not hard.
Same basic ingredients, just in a slightly different manufacturing format.
And when I go from here with being flour that I can't ingest, with a little bit of lard, a little bit of soda if I'm lucky, and some water, I get to this, and this is something I can either eat quickly or throw in a haversack and take on the march with me.
Exactly.
Wow. Well, I'm going to keep eating because these are delicious, and I skipped lunch today. But, geez, Andrew, this is a completely different way to approach the ration for me with so much time doing federal here. Thank you so much for sharing this with me.
Absolutely. No, the Confederate ration and the Confederate cooking equipment is an often misunderstood component of Confederate soldier life. So going through the experimental archaeology of actually cooking the ration and doing it the way they did it's really helpful to understand from individual's perspective as well as sharing out to others.
Okay. And if I look to do this at home for somebody who maybe isn't in the field in wool like you and I are, any thoughts, any suggestions?
You can do essentially the same thing as far as cooking with the same basic ingredients. And you can cook them in a baking dish, just putting them in the oven. Whether it's in a cast iron skillet or, like I said, a baking dish or on a cookie sheet, cooking at about 400 degrees for the same amount of time. Again, it's a little bit of playing it by ear where you're going to be adjusting and gauging your temperatures. There's no perfect art to it, but you can do essentially the same thing in an actual oven itself.
Well, thank you so much for hosting us, and thank you for spending time with Civil War Digital Digest. I mean, we all have to eat. Food is a way to connect with history, and Andrew and the team here at Manassas National Battlefield Park hosted us and made it so we could bring this closer connection to you. Whether you try it in the field or try it at home, have a look at these biscuits, give them a try, connect with history. See you down the road.